to take myself down to be in communion with Mother Earth, and I'm going to ask too that you find some place that you can touch with your knee or your hand, some place that you can touch, as we recognize that it is our humility that is the source of our power. It is our humility that is a source of our power. Now up the water of life. Now Seneb, the water of health. Now Uja, the water of strength. As we pay homage to our ancestors, those who are fortunate to be buried in the soils of Africa, the cradle of civilization. We pay homage to those who were the mothers and the fathers, who were the architects, the scientists, the educators, the agriculturalists, the mathematicians, the community builders, the spiritual leaders, the warriors. We pay homage to Imhotep of Kemet, this African place of spiritual and intellectual advancement, Imhotep, whose name means I come in peace, the earliest known physician, whose work gave us the foundational anatomical observations and prescriptions for cure. To those who were the natural caretakers of the earth's most precious minerals, to those family groups and lines who lived interdependently, thereby creating and maintaining order. If you agree, we say Dua Neter, and we pay homage to those who withstood the daily life-changing sacrifices made under European colonization and the transatlantic trade of enslaved Africans. Dua Neter. We pay homage to those who were lost in the Middle Passage, to those who could not endure the months at sea, objectified as cargo in horrifically inhumane conditions that disallowed cleanliness, warmth, nourishment, or love. We honor the water that is your eternal home. Dua Neter. We pay homage to those whose bones rest in the earth, in the Americas. We thank those who lived in the shackles of bondage and its legacy. We thank the thousands of Africans among the first in America who came through Richmond's notorious markets, bringing both the knowledge and strength of the motherland and despair. Dua Neter. We honor those who in death are without rest, as skeletal specimens for not the benefit of themselves or their community, who completed their cycle of life in a dry well. We honor our African foreparents, some of whom were sold and bought at 19th and Main Streets in the Union Hotel, later occupied for medical education by Hampton City College. We honor our foreparents, whose eternal rest was curtailed as the Medical College of Virginia organized itself, perhaps knowingly adjacent to what has been reclaimed as Richmond's African burial ground. Dua Neter. We remember our African family in Richmond and elsewhere who fell victim to the callous objectification of medical research without ethics, for whom this treatment was heinous, without regard for the God in them and thus their humanity. We honor those who now finally elevate as beings of light, and who will now, centuries later, have their dignity restored. Duanatea. We honor our family, for whom its descendant community is giving them voice, honor, and rest. Duanatea. We are because you were. It is upon your broad shoulders that we stand, for you have trod the path to make our way clearer. We ask for your continued blessings. Duanatea. Ake on Akura. Everlasting life to our great golden souls. Duanatea. Praises to the divine. Duanatea. Praises to the divine. Duanatea. Praises to the divine.
Good evening. It's an honor and a privilege to be here this afternoon to welcome you to such a significant place and time in our history. Because the well and our ancestors who were discovered in that place rose up and said to us that our history needs to be visited and recognized, and that the dignity and the honor that all men created by God deserves. And so tonight, we are here to say that the voices of the grave has been heard, and that we have taken the time to be remorseful, to beg for forgiveness, and to do whatever we can humanly think possible to attempt to bring back and restore a dignity that was denied. So I am very honored when I was asked to be a part of the planning committee, and all of the members that served on the planning committee. Our hearts were heavy, our spirits were stirred and disturbed, and our determination was consistent to do the best that we could to honor those that we had dishonored, and to also respectfully account our history with the intention of putting forth an effort that we not repeat it again. So on behalf of the Planning Committee, the family that was birthed out of the Planning Committee, the work that you have done, the honor, the respect, the holding each one accountable, to push farther, to look farther, to research farther, and for VCU saying we are a partner in this effort, that our ancestors are all of our ancestors. There is no separation of one or the other, and that we all come together. I want to thank VCU for their staff, their leadership that they have brought. I'm not going to start calling names, because if I do without a list in front of me, I'm certainly going to miss the name of someone significantly important that have contributed to this effort, but I'm sure before this evening is over, you will all get your recognition for the work that you have done. I welcome you. I would suggest that there is a sign-in sheet, because when the history story is told, I want it to be said that each one of you were here tonight as a witness to the work that still needs to be done and the promises that we are making that it will be done and that we will continue this work. Thank you very much.
Good evening. My name is Don Edwards, and I've been asked to just make sure that there's a context for how we got here tonight. I was honored to be part of a team of consultants that VCU selected and gave a pretty important and big challenge to, and that was to design a process that would make it possible for us both to honor the work and to leave a record of what we did for the folks who are going to surely look to the work that was done by the Planning Committee and the Family Representative Council and all the other folks who joined us, so that we can continue the work of recognizing the unrecognized history and honoring the lives that have not been honored. So the first thing I want to do, because when I met with Stephen and Lori a little earlier today, and they told me what they wanted me to do, I said, well, I can do that. So first things I would like us to do is just give ourselves a hand. Let's all just give some thanks, because nobody knew we were going to get here when we started. And in truth, I will tell you that I wasn't always sure where we were going to end up or when. The fact of the matter is, this process that we executed is something new. There were some elements to it that had been tried, like having these community conversations in small groups with facilitators and scribes and inviting the public in and asking them to respond with their recommendations and suggestions. That had been done. Not with this subject. There was also a component in which we decided that we had to have education as every part of our programming, because in point of fact, there weren't agreements about what really happened, what was known, what were the facts. And so we incorporated that component. We also wanted, if you will remember, for those of you who came to some of those conversations or have gone online to view them, and they're all there because VCU committed themselves to documentation at that level, you will see that we always had an ending of the program or the conversation with a cultural component of local people from Richmond. We wanted folks to see the assets, the cultural assets that were present in Richmond that some people might have known about, but everybody needed to know about. I want to mention a couple of other things, because amongst us who were working on the Family Representative Council, and I'm not going to steal any of your thunder, Dr. Jones, but I just want to personally talk about what it took for people to assume a role of caring and concern over a distance of 170 years. Just think about that for a minute. I work a lot with people whose responsibility it is to try and deliberate and think through problems and reach consensus. But this was more than that. We were asking people, and we were in partnership with folks sitting here right in front of me, to put themselves in a relationship with folks they would never really know except through their imagination, through their cultural imagination, their spiritual imagination. and through the imagination that comes out of their own lives, linking the experience and responsibility to their experience with their own family members. And I got to tell you, as a witness to that, they know, as I know, that we share some very special moments. There are some indelible images that I have in my mind as I talk tonight, that if you weren't there, you will not know what it was like to be a part of this project. And I want to thank Dr. Rao, obviously. I remember your opening program and the leadership you showed there. But Dr. Allison and Stephen Davenport, our erstwhile partners in this process, you made it possible for us to do it right, even though we didn't start out knowing what right looked like. We made this up really as we were doing it. And I will tell you that it isn't often that you find the kind of faithfulness that allows people to fly with that kind of blindness where there is so much at stake. And by being at stake, I mean having to respond to people who are going to ask questions about what is going on, when is it going to be done, what's going to happen, where is this all headed? We didn't really know every time we got asked those questions. And in point of fact, in the next phase, we still have to bring that faith to the table. I want to just say a few words about some stuff that, I know that stories are very important. So I know that I am my great-great-grandparents' dream. George and Charlotte Butler were the property of Mr. Butler down in Barnwell, South Carolina in the early 1800s. And when I think about the impact of this project on me personally, I will tell you that I've gone all over the country and some parts of outside the country. And I tell people about this project because it just really redefined a whole area of work for me. And I just want to try and help everyone who's here and everyone you'll tell about this program to really appreciate the courage and the leadership that was shown by the members of the Planning Committee and their diversity, the members of the Family Representative Council who stepped up into this huge trust relationship, and then, saw it through. Dr. Jones, you're going to deliver the recommendations, and those recommendations are powerful. This was an authentic process, and that's why it is powerful, because it was not all about we all agreed at all times and we were all on the same page all the time. This was like real family. And at the end of someone's life and family, all kinds of things come out. All kinds of things get talked about, and people have to agree, sometimes to disagree. They have to have enough faith to say, look, we're not doing this for us, we're doing it for these other people. We're doing it for our responsibility. And so I am happy to be able to acknowledge all of that and to hopefully give you just a taste of the context. It is going to be hard, but I do say, because it was documented, go to the website and see what was produced. I think you will be, you will find, as I have and others have, that we can do more than we think when we put our minds to it and let ourselves be guided by greater spirits. So I just want to say thank you for all of the opportunity that I and my colleagues and the team that was part of our group that worked with all of you. It was a great honor and a privilege. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Joseph Jones, and I'm a member of the Family Representative Council, and my task this evening is to present our final recommendations for research, memorialization, and proper interment of the East Marshall Street well ancestral remains. I would like to begin by acknowledging some of the people who have supported the project and the FRC to date. The individuals include President Rao, Associate Vice President Kevin Allison, the members of the Planning Committee, especially, I don't know if he's here, Reverend Dr. J. Elijah Burke, who served as a liaison from the Planning Committee. Mr. Stephen Davenport from the Office of the President, and Don Edwards, Gwen Whiting, and Brandon Mayo of Justice and Sustainability Associates. We would also like to express our sincere thanks and admiration for Professor Sean Yutzi, whose film Until the Well Runs Dry brought critical attention to the matter of the well and the ancestral remains. Lastly, I would like to acknowledge my Family Representative Council, fellow Family Representative Council members, those in attendance and those who are not in attendance. In alphabetical order, they are Stacy Burrs, Jennifer Early, and I'll ask you to stand if you would, or if you're not comfortable doing so, just raise your hand so that people can see you. Jennifer Early, Lily Estes, looks like it's not here, Carmen Foster, Christopher Green, Crystal Noakes, Rhonda Keys Pleasant, and Stephanie Smith and Janet Queen and Zinga Taylor are not here. The last two are not here. I heard from Queen earlier today. She's had car trouble, so at the worst possible moment. But she's in our thoughts and prayers. Thank you. So the FRC was convened in August of 2015 with the charge to represent the descendant community of the human remains discovered in a well near East Marshall Street and to make recommendations to the VCU East Marshall Street Well Planning Committee to support the appropriate study, memorialization, and reburial with dignity. You can see here, and as was alluded to by Don, we followed a model. There was a model in place that gave us some guidance as to how we would ultimately come up with the Family Representative Council and the recommendations that I would share with you momentarily. And that model came out of the New York African Burial Ground, an archaeological or bioarchaeological project, similar in nature but different in size and scope. But out of that model came this idea of community consultations in which we'd have these listening sessions in which we, as in this case VCU, in that case it was the United States General Services Administration, will work as partners with community members and would come together to develop research questions and agenda and to determine the final disposition of the ancestral remains. Following that model, we had a series of 4 community consultations, out of which came the nominations and ultimately the selected members, 10 selected members of the Family Representative Council. And our task, as I stated a moment ago, was to come up with recommendations for the research, memorialization, us fairly better represented. Although I'm afraid I think Rhonda was not able to make that one, our queen again. But our task was to come up with these recommendations for research, memorialization, and reburial. Which may sound somewhat straightforward, but as Don also suggested, this process was a difficult one. For myself, I can say that, I'm used to, as a scientist, I'm used to being on the other side of the table. I'm used to asking people what they want, not generating ideas. It's a qualitatively different experience, and serving as what we call surrogate family members or surrogate descendants of these ancestral remains. And so while this task may seem straightforward, the excavation required that we first establish shared goals and a framework for honoring the ancestors through memorialization and interment, and also for establishing what we know and what we would hope to know and come to know about them through research. And so that process it was a 3-step process, the first of which was to synthesize and to review the feedback that was gathered over the course of those 4 community consultations. It was a large amount of data that was generated through these community consultations. Those data actually, in several instances, gave us pause and had us go back and reconsider some of the common beliefs and ideas that we that we brought collectively to this process. And so we carefully reviewed that feedback to make sure that we were faithfully honoring the wishes, the concerns, and the desires of the community with respect to the research and memorialization and interment of these remains. Following that step, we developed a set of principles that would inform and guide the collective decision-making process. So things like a multidisciplinary approach with respect to research was important for us. The idea that there are multiple ways of knowing, multiple modes of inquiry, all important. The science that which I tend to gravitate towards because of my own academic background is but one way of knowing. You know, for many of us starting out, we were totally fine if there was to be no scientific research, especially considering the unique circumstances of these individuals being found in a will after having been sacrificed for the development of American medical science. We were completely fine with that. But again, going back to the first step in listening to the community members and what they wanted, we thought that we should honor those wishes and ask for scientific research, but also realizing that science can be done respectfully, that there are those who have engaged with community members, in this case African diaspora community members, and who are aware of and are sensitive to many of the issues that we brought to the table ourselves. And so that process was one in which we were able to come up with ultimately a framework that I will return to momentarily. And then lastly, education was critical. We had to inform ourselves. We had to educate ourselves with respect to all the different dimensions of research, memorialization, and interment so that we could properly and faithfully represent the community and then also honor the ancestors. And so that process was one in which one that included many site visits. We went up to New York to see the African burial ground site and to see the memorials that were developed there. We went to the Department of Historic Resources. We went up to the Smithsonian and actually saw the skeletal remains, the ancestral remains, which is critical to the process that was critical to coming up with the recommendation that the remains return home. Seeing them, it was understood immediately by all that they did not deserve to be in anyone's permanent collection. They needed to come home. Right? So this process of education was one that was, deeply personal, but also necessary for us so that we could provide, work through, with informed consent and understanding all of the different dynamics potentially at play with respect to research, memorialization, and ultimately interment. Finally, with benefit of these experiences and additional research conducted by the working groups, the FRC members drafted recommendations for research, memorialization, and interment of the ancestral remains. Draft recommendations were presented to the members of the East Marshall Street Well Planning Committee and to the public during the 5th community consultation in 2016. The feedback received from those events informed the final recommendations that are presented here tonight. The research working group was led by Crystal Noakes. The other members included Jennifer Early, Lily Estes, and myself. Research was conceptualized broadly. I mentioned scientific research, but we also, as I stated earlier, recognize other equally important ways of knowing, including oral history, ethnography, and other fields outside of the biological sciences that will contribute to our understanding of who these people were and who they understood, most importantly, who they understood themselves to be, which is what we're trying to capture through proper research so that we can properly memorialize these individuals. So what types of research, a key question, a key consideration was what types of research are appropriate and will most likely yield useful results and findings. I know I'm breaking a cardinal rule here and putting up a lot of text and asking you instead to listen to me and not read ahead. On your honor, I'll ask you to stick with me here. First research recommendation is the return of all ancestral remains to the city of Richmond. As I mentioned a moment ago, that I think was solidified, at least in my mind, and I think in the minds of all others, once we went and saw the remains there, that initial impact. And I've seen a lot of skeletal remains. This is my field of study, but walking into that room, seeing those remains on the tables, unexpectedly, I should add. We went in thinking that we were walking into a coat room, and many of the, several of the people of the RC began to cry. And I think for many of us, that solidified the idea that if there was any doubt, that these remains need to return. So I won't explain or elaborate on all of these in the interest of time. But there are a few like this first one that I think warrant an explanation. Two, VCU should determine. Thank you. VCU should determine the feasibility of locating and retrieving the possible ancestors still located beneath the Kontos building. Number three, no further analysis of the ancestral remains or associated artifacts should take place prior to approval of an East Marshall Street Well project research agenda developed with community input. Number four, future analysis of artifacts associated with the ancestors should involve only non-destructive methods. Number five, research should include study of the long-term implications, impacts, and relevance of the well site history for contemporary African-American medical experiences. Number six, DNA and microbial analysis of the ancestral remains should be undertaken for specific purposes of reconstructing regional genetic ancestry, assessing molecular sex of juveniles, reconstructing health environments, and identifying possible biological relationships with a targeted sample of living descendants. Okay, so that's a mouthful, but it goes back to the point that I attempted to make earlier, which is that there is a way of respectfully doing this analysis. In an otherwise, I thought, a very accurate and nice accounting of the project to date, and if you may have seen in last week's Richmond Times-Dispatch, there was one, I think, miscue between myself and the author with respect to the science. And that is that in speaking to a geneticist from Howard University, many of us had our concerns and fears assuaged with respect to whether or not anonymity and proper protocols could be put into place to protect any individuals who might engage in this type of research, individuals who may want to assess whether or not they have some type of biological affinity with some of these remains. The article suggested that was the primary concern, but that was not a concern coming out of our educational experiences. Rather, the concern was, as I mentioned earlier, whether or not any invasive research should be done, given the context in which these individuals were found and who they were. That was the primary concern. So I thought it important to clear the record to make it known that those issues of anonymity did come up and they had been addressed and will be addressed through the implementation process, through the development of safe, ethical protocols for such research. Lastly, VCU should establish and has actually begun this process of establishing a research steering committee to assist with RFP development and the vetting of and selection of proposals. The Memorialization Working Group was led by Stacy Burrs. The other members included Christopher Green, Stephanie Smith, and Janet Queen-Nzinga Taylor. Rhonda Pleasance led the Interment Working Group, which also included Carmen Foster, Queen Nzinga, who was pulling double duty there. In fact, all of them pulled double duty because the Memorialization and Interment Working Groups ended up working together so closely. We found that those topics were so intertwined that they really had to work together to co-develop their recommendations. And so they collaborated and essentially ultimately integrated. For the FRC, memorialization and respectful interment of the ancestral remains are understood as important elements in a larger process of restorative justice. This process involves public remembrance and commemoration, and two distinct locations have been identified as appropriate for physical memorialization: the Kontos building and the future interment site. These recommendations reflect the FRC's desire to see properly honored not only the bodies of our East Marshall Street Well ancestors, but also their experiences and their legacies. Number one, under memorialization, physical memorialization of the East Marshall Street Well ancestors and their experiences at 4 locations within or near the Kontos building. Those locations are spelled out in the report. Most immediately, we think the VCU should place signage indicating the excavation location and the historical significance of the ancestral remains near the building entrance. Construction of a significantly appropriate memorial and an interactive learning center at the site of interment. Number 3, an annual memorialization event to be observed by all medical students prior to undertaking the first anatomy class. Number 4, development of formal guidelines for appropriate university actions, including community engagement, in the event of future discovery of human skeletal remains or material culture. As Don has said, much of this information is probably already lives online, but needs to be codified in such a way that should remains be found again, this process will be easily understood by all. Number 5, an East Marshall Street Well Memorialization Steering Committee to assist with development and vetting of selection of proposals. And number 6, we recommend that VCU should initiate a formal study of the legacy of slavery within the history of the university and mechanisms for redressing this legacy. This is in line with what other universities are doing. Many of you are probably aware of the University Studying Slavery initiative. I believe it's housed at University of Virginia, and I believe VCU is a part of that consortium. And we think that time is now to, especially now, in light of other occurrences, debates over the Confederate statues, et cetera. The time is now to address head-on this legacy of slavery, which entailed, as we see with these remains, the constant, and actually necessitated the constant breaking of human bodies and human relationships. And any reconciliation should be understood as a process that begins by going through that history. And so we think that an important step would be a formal study of that legacy at the institution. First recommendation with respect to interment is that all East Marshall Street Well ancestral remains and associated artifacts will be interred underground at the African burial ground located in the city of Richmond. We understand that not all individuals, or perhaps none of the individuals, were actually derived from that, but the African burial ground is a place of such cultural and historical significance, and there is a historical relationship between the burial ground and the university, and such that that legacy might also be codified through the interment of the remains at that site. Alternative sites would be the Evergreen Cemetery. Number 2, interment ceremony is designed by funerary experts, should be designed by funerary experts in Western African burial traditions in consultation with members of the FRC who will actually serve on the implementation committee. Number 3, the coffin boxes should be designed and crafted by West African artisans for burial of the ancestral remains and related artifacts. We were heavily influenced by what we saw at the New York African Burial Ground with regards to these last 2 recommendations. And number 4, VCU should establish an East Marshall Street Well Interment Steering Committee. And in fact, as with the other 2 sets of recommendations, has already begun to do so, who would help with the development and vetting of and selection of proposals. And so, in closing, I would just like to congratulate everyone who has contributed thus far to this process, because you are honorary members of the Black Lives Matter movement, whether or not you realize it. This is Black Lives Matter. This is what got me into the discipline of anthropology, the New York African Burial Ground Project, and seeing that we can retroactively make these Black lives matter, and that history matters. If I mentioned a framework, history matters, symbols matter. In fact, one of the most potent forms of symbolic violence is the denial and desecration of human burials throughout time. That we've seen that, and so the restoration of those relationships is critically important as we move forward. And then finally, as we said, for us, this is a matter of restorative justice, and we are proud to see and happy to see VCU taking a leadership role in that process. Thank you.
Joseph, thank you very much for a very thoughtful presentation of recommendations. We received them with gratitude. It has been a lot of work on the part of the Family Representatives Council, and for that we are very grateful to all of you for the time that you have invested and the thoughtfulness that you have given to all of this. And it's important work. Also, as Janine may have left, but I wanted to thank her for what I thought was a very um, important emotional and spiritual opportunity for all of us to be thoughtful about fellow human beings and what all of this really means. We're all still in many ways trying to figure that out. Ellen, thank you for your really very perfect words. I thought that you captured beautifully, just very beautifully, what all of this means, and particularly talked about where we're headed in the future. And I think that's important as well. And I say the same to Don for, as usual, being just such a perfect gentleman and positively bringing all of us together and recognizing the good things that people do, which is not something everyone does, but thank you for doing that, because it does help us when we talk about the good things that people do. It helps us to also talk about the things that are not so good in ways that enable us to be civil in that dialogue. So thank you as well. And I, of course, want to add, because you really can't say enough about Kevin Allison and the thoughtfulness that he's brought to this. He's just a a brilliant teacher, a brilliant professor, I should say, someone who has an ability to help us really be as deeply thoughtful as we need to be about really important things. And this is something that is tremendously important because it's human lives. And Stephen Davenport is here someplace from my office, and oh, there you are, Stephen, as usual, trying to low profile all the great things that you do. So thank you, and thank you, Lori, for also stepping in to be helpful with this. And so what I see from the recommendations is that we obviously have had thoughtful partners and advocates in thinking about in a challenging situation, where do we go with this? And so I want to say thank you for these very thoughtful recommendations. Ultimately, what we do will focus on recognizing and honoring the people, the human beings, whose identities we really don't know. And Janine tried to help us sort of get to a point where we might be thoughtful about knowing the ancestors of our brothers and sisters, many of whom are probably here in the Richmond region and maybe elsewhere as well. But, while we don't know them, we certainly do now know their legacy. And I'm thoughtful about the fact that they have brought us together. They have brought us together for some important conversations about how we go forward as human beings. We can't change the past, we can't reverse it, but we can change the future, and we can certainly be thoughtful about what a university does in a situation that we now fortunately recognize as horribly inhumane, wrong, for which, by the way, VCU and all of its predecessor institutions acknowledges and apologizes for. These were wrong things, just awful things, horrible things, human lives. So there's nothing more important than human lives. We all know that, but we haven't always all known that, and we certainly haven't viewed every human life in the way that we need to. We still don't. We have a lot of work to do. If you think about where VCU is, the collection of so many different wonderful human beings who make this institution what it is today, we clearly have an opportunity like we've never had, an opportunity to really think about how, in our implementation of these great recommendations, we now can not only be certain that the kinds of things that happen never happen again, but be thoughtful about, in an empathetic way, what every human life really should mean to all of us. And I say should because I wish I could say that we're all there. We're not. We have a long way to go. We still, as human beings, have, I will call them brothers and sisters who are alive today, who work hard at separating all of us and finding ways to put us in hierarchies, some of us more valuable than others, and all of that's just wrong. It's just so wrong. And as we continue to use VCU as a vehicle to help shape society through our students and through members of our community, this will be an incredibly important opportunity as we implement these recommendations together, Joseph, that you have presented to really take VCU to the next level. So with that, I'm very grateful to the FRC. I'm very grateful to all of you for your thoughtfulness, and I think it has the power to really bring the human experience to the next step up. And I'm excited about that. And I look forward to being on this journey together with all of you. Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm going to try not to be too redundant, but I do want to express profound and extreme appreciation to the members both of the Planning Committee and of the Family Representative Council. It has truly been an honor and a privilege to work with you. The level of authentic engagement that you have demonstrated in this work is so incredible, so moving, so powerful. So thank you. I also want to offer just name a few other folks. I'll again acknowledge Stephen Davenport. I want to thank Justice and Sustainability Associates. I also want to thank the Department of Historic Resources in terms of their engagement with us to really support a process around engaging the community effectively. And I also want to name Dr. Michael Blakey, the faculty member at William and Mary, who really was instrumental in helping lead us in the very early days in shaping this process and really thinking about it deeply. All of you have made such incredible contributions to this work, and the Richmond community in terms of the engagement with the consultations. And we're hoping to continue to work with you as we do this transition from planning and the development of recommendations to implementation. There's more work to be done. And so on the East Marshall Street website is information, and that's been released and made public. As you saw, we are going to be forming 3 steering committees: research, memorialization, and internment. And members of the planning and the FRC have graciously committed to continue, and so we're very appreciative of being able to continue the work and this journey with you. But we also invite participation from other members of the community to self-nominate or to be nominated relative to service on these committees. That nomination form is available on the East Marshall Street website, and that is emsw.vcu.edu. And so please, if you're interested, examine that information. If you have questions, Lori Carter, Lori, if you will indicate yourself in the back. Lori's the Associate Director of VCU Center for Urban Communities. She's available for questions if you have about that work and the self-nomination or the nomination process, but we'd welcome your engagement in this next stage of work. Also, Lori will be taking information for folks who are interested in following and continuing to learn about the work of the implementation steering committees. So she's got to sign up and can provide that information. So again, thank you for joining us this evening. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Rapley.
So I too want to join the rest of the people who have spoken to here tonight, and also all of us to thank the people who took this responsibility to heart and to help us to demonstrate to all that these lives do matter. The remains that were found are associated with real people. They had real lives. We don't understand them very well because it happened so long ago. But the work of understanding first discovering our history, parts of it that are difficult to face, and then understanding it as best we can, and then telling that story loud and clear is essential to preventing this from happening again. And I share Dr. Rao's sense that these things can happen to us again. We have seen ourselves repeat atrocities of history, and it's our obligation to dedicate ourselves to stopping that. We can do that when we look to the thousands of young people that we help have a career in medicine and health and wellness, in science. And how do we help them understand what has happened in the past and how do we prevent that from happening again? Because if that is not part of our journey, if that is not part of our research and our education and our service to one another, then it will happen again. It has to be deeply felt and it has to be deeply integrated into all aspects of how we think and plan, how we teach, how we learn, how we care for one another. So I thank all of you for guiding us on this journey that we're about to take a next step towards truly giving the respect that is due and needs to be made visible to the people whose remains were discovered, and to showing the world that we are dedicated to not allowing this to happen again. So I have the pleasure of inviting you to join the reception, and thank you finally for this program, and look forward to working together in the future.